Hey guys, we're going to start going over the requirements for photosynthesis. Remember, there were 6 requirements. We'll try to keep them in some type of order. The first one, obviously, is sunlight. It's important for you guys to know how sunlight travels. Remember, it travels in wavelengths. And remember, your wavelengths are Roy G. Biv. Remember that each wavelength is a different amount of energy, so the goal of the plant or the leaf is to absorb as many of those wavelengths as possible to maximize as much energy they can get from the sun to produce as much glucose or starch as possible. Also remember that sunlight travels in particles called photons. Photons. Remember that light is considered to be inorganic energy, and that is what you are transforming into organic energy. Another requirement is pigment. And remember, pigments are what will absorb the sunlight. Remember that chlorophyll is the main pigment. And remember that chloroplast stores the pigments. And there's different plastids for different types of pigments. Even though chlorophyll is the main pigment, some plant leaves will contain red, orange, or yellow pigments, which are different plastids. Another requirement is water. Remember how water gets to the leaf through capillary action and the properties of water, the adhesive and cohesive properties of water. Remember that water, its primary job ultimately will to produce H+ ions. They're going to help make ATP and NADPH, and indirectly it's responsible for producing O2 into the atmosphere. CO2 is another requirement that's taken in from the atmosphere. All right, animals breathe it out, and it's also a result of fossil fuels being burned. Our plants will absorb the CO2 through their stomata. Another requirement is ATP. Remember, ATP will fuel the dark reaction. And then the last requirement is going to be NADPH. Again, these two guys will then go to the dark reaction and transform their energy into the energy to make glucose. So remember, we're trying to understand a theme here of how photosynthesis is a transformation process. Ultimately, you're taking sunlight, transforming it into ATP and NADPH, which will then transform their energy into making glucose or sugar for the plant. Remember, there are 2 reactions in photosynthesis, the light and the dark reaction. The light is referred to as the light-dependent reaction because light is needed to fuel this process, and the dark reaction is independent because light is not directly used in that step. Remember that these 2 processes ultimately work together. So we have to know what goes in, or the reactants to each of these steps, and then what comes out, which is the product of each of these steps. So what goes into the light reaction is obviously sunlight, and then water. What comes out of the process will be ATP, NADPH, and oxygen. Remember, ATP, NADPH are going to be used in the dark reaction. Actually, I wrote that in the wrong order there, guys. I apologize. So we have this as independent. What comes out is going to be ATP, NADPH, all right, and then oxygen. These guys here are what will go to the dark reaction and be the reactants there. So now we have ATP, NADPH entering the dark reaction along with now CO2 from the environment. Again, it enters through the stomata. And what you get as a product ultimately is glucose, or sugar, and then you're going to regenerate ADP and then NADP, which go back to the light reactions. This process here, light reaction, takes place in the disc-like structure called the thylakoid. So in the thylakoid is where your pigment molecules are stored. So in this particular case, it's where chlorophyll is stored. And the dark reaction takes place in the stroma, which is all the space between the thylakoids. If you want to take a look at this picture down here, remember this whole picture here, the structure is a chloroplast. Again, it's a plastid that stores chlorophyll. You have your light reaction, and then you have your dark reaction. All right. You have sunlight coming in and being absorbed by the pigments. You have water entering the leaf through capillary action. Again, this all takes place here in the thylakoids, the stack of discs that contains the pigments. This process takes place and needs sun. It produces oxygen, which gets released into the atmosphere. It produces ATP and then NADPH, which is going to fuel the dark reactions. The dark reactions use CO2 from the environment, which again comes from animals and the burning of fossil fuel. It's going to use this ATP and use NADPH to fuel this reaction to ultimately make sugar, which is food for the plant. And then it's going to recycle back ADP and NADP. There are some things that affect the rate of photosynthesis as well. Temperature can affect how well a plant goes through the process. It could be either too hot or too cold. Water can affect the process. You can have not enough or too much water. Sunlight or light, which you might not have enough, but eventually you really can't give too much to. And CO2, same thing. You can never give a plant enough CO2. So these are all factors that will affect the rate of photosynthesis. Other notes: how do we measure how well a plant's going through the process? We can measure the amount of O2 that is being produced. So in the case of a plant, we could put a freshwater plant into water and see the bubbles being produced. Or you can measure the actual growth of a plant as well. These are the two easiest ways to determine how well a plant's going through the process. Also, guys, keep in mind and remember the equation for photosynthesis. And the equation for photosynthesis, remember your reactants and your products. 6 CO2 molecules plus 6 H2O molecules, and then sunlight will produce C6, H12, O6 plus 6 O2. Good luck and bring any questions in tomorrow.